Ambassador Mark Regev is a veteran diplomat who currently chairs the Abba Eban Institute for Diplomacy and Foreign Relations at Reichman University. He served as the Prime Minister's senior advisor for foreign affairs and international communications and was Israel's ambassador to the United Kingdom. Previously, he was the international spokesman for the Prime Minister's office. Mark Regev is also a visiting fellow at the Institute for National Security. Thank you so much for joining me here at the Media Line.
My pleasure.
Ambassador Regev, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has gotten his fair share of negative press from those not liking the new government's political alignment, even before it had a chance to govern or to flesh out its policies. Is it fair to call out the alarm bells yet?
I think the government should be given the credit that it is due. It is a democratically elected government. Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, and this government has been freely elected by the Israeli people. Some might like the result, some might not like the result, but I think we should all respect the process. Now, I've been hearing from leaders from across the globe, and they've been saying that they will judge this Israeli government by its actions, and I think that's fair. I think that's the right approach to take, and I think that's what people should be doing.
What are the priorities of the new Israeli government in your estimation?
I would put them in two categories, priorities on the domestic front and priorities on the international front. On the domestic front, of course, dealing with the rising prices in Israel, obviously for Israeli voters. Often pocketbook issues are crucial. And of course, though they don't get the traction that in the international media, those issues are very, very important to Israelis. And the government will be tested and challenged on its ability to control rising prices. Just anyone who watched the news last night on the 3 television networks in Israel would have seen that rising prices was the opening story, I think, on all 3 of them. So that's one issue of domestic concern. Another issue of domestic concern is what we call the issue of lawlessness in parts of Israeli society. There's no doubt that across the board, both on the left and the right, there's a feeling in Israel that the police need to get on top of crime, law enforcement, law and order. These things have to be put back on track. And I think here the new Israeli government will have a priority. On the international arena, I think the new government of Israel will be focused on, of course, maintaining our very strong alliance with the United States of America, our most important international partner, at the same time to strengthen relationships with Europe. And of course, a huge priority on our Arab peace partners, whether it's the older peace partners of Egypt and Jordan, or it's the newer peace partners in the Gulf, the Emirates and Bahrain, Morocco in North Africa. These countries who we signed in 2020, the Abraham Accords agreements. I know that Prime Minister Netanyahu has already spoken to the leaders of some of these countries, and I think he's expected to visit some of them very, very soon. I think the larger challenge is how do we not only cement the peace that has already been signed and put more meat on the bones, so to speak. In other words, expand those relationships and make them stronger and deeper by strengthening the different levels of cooperation and the different avenues of cooperation. But I think the bigger challenge is how do we expand the circle of peace and see other Arab and Muslim countries join the circle of peace. And I think that's something that Prime Minister Netanyahu can be expected to do.
All eyes are on Saudi Arabia, the crown jewel of the Middle East, as the next country for normalization with Israel. Do you think this is a possibility despite the fact that the Saudi government is stating clearly that Israel needs to get in the game in terms of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict?
Saudi Arabia, the normalization of relationships between Jerusalem and Riyadh, I think that is it is inevitable. The only question is to the timing. Will it happen in the coming months, or will we have to wait a bit longer? And here, I don't know. There are many, many moving parts. One part Israel has very little control over, and that's US-Saudi relations. There's no doubt that America played an important role in achieving the Abraham Accords. And if American-Saudi relationships are not as good as they could be, maybe that has a negative impact also on Israel as well. But we'll have to wait and see. I hope it happens soon. I just don't know.
Some media made it sound as if the government would not find support in the international community unless it adopts specific policies, whether it's a pact with the Palestinians or an agreement with the U.S. on Iranian policy. Are those who are writing the new government's obituary doing it too prematurely?
Definitely. And I think on both the issues you raise, I think there's a nuance that maybe wasn't there a few years ago. Firstly, on the Iranian issue. If there were concerns in Israel not that long ago that the Biden administration was racing forward to recommit to the JCPOA, the defunct, very flawed deal that was signed with Iran, and there were concerns in Israel that the Biden administration was trying to revisit that deal, especially after it sort of abandoned its earlier calls for a stronger and longer deal. Those concerns have been sidelined. I mean, there's no doubt that the Iranian position in America and throughout the West has been damaged severely by both its brutal treatment of the freedom protests across Iran. The protests that broke out in September have much sympathy and support across the West. The idea that this regime is killing its people, specifically killing its young women who just want the basic freedoms that they're entitled to. I think the Iranian regime has lost a lot of its cachet, a lot of its any sort of legitimacy that it had abroad. It has lost much of that. The way it's treating its people, the brutal suppression of the freedom protests. And at the same time, of course, Iran has been helping Russia in its war in the Ukraine. And literally hundreds of Iranian-made drones have already been fired at Ukrainian cities by the Russian forces. On both those issues, the United States and the West has a serious problem with Tehran. And I think it's possible that we won't have to see a US-Israel disagreement on Iran, precisely because it appears that a return to the JCPOA, at least for the moment, seems not to be on the agenda. I think the White House itself has publicly addressed this and said that this cannot happen as long as Iran is supporting the Russian war effort in Ukraine as it is, and as it is murdering its own people in these as they crack down on the demonstrations. So it's possible that issue, the Iranian issue, which was such a bone of contention during the term of the previous American president, Barack Obama, it does not have to be necessarily a bone of contention now in the Biden-Netanyahu relationship. On the Palestinian issue, I think we've also moved on a bit. I think there's increasing understanding in Washington that the Palestinians are a flawed peace partner. I mean, in the past, many in Europe and even in America, it was all Israel's fault. It was always Israel's fault. Israel had to be more forthcoming. Israel had to be more flexible. The onus was always placed on Israel. I think today there is an understanding that Israel can't do it all by itself, that the Palestinians are a flawed peace partner, and that the idea that somehow all Israel has to do is press some magic button and there is an immediate breakthrough. I think it's understood that is just not realistic.
What will change it?
By moving forward where it's possible to move forward, and that is Israel's relationship with the Arab world, Israel's relationship with the Muslim world. By pushing those relationships, by making Israel part of the Middle East, by having one peace breakthrough after another with the Arab world and with Muslim countries, you are creating a new reality. And if the Palestinians aren't ready today to recognize the Jewish state, if the Palestinians are not ready for the sort of compromises that will be needed for them to make peace with Israel, I think by Israel being better integrated into the region, by Israel being seen by our Arab neighbors not as an enemy, but as a partner, as a friend, as an ally. When they see the cooperation that exists between Israel and across the Arab world, I think that has to, in the medium term and the long term, affect Palestinian opinion as well, and hopefully lead to peace between us and the Palestinians.
You brought up Ukraine, and specifically, I want to address the issue of Israel having to find a place in the middle because of the need to have Russia as a friend and the overflies through Syria. Do you think Prime Minister Netanyahu is going to stay the course set by his predecessor when it comes to the Ukraine war?
So I don't accept the characterization that Israel is playing it in the middle. Israel condemned the Russian invasion when it happened. We've repeatedly voted that way at the United Nations. We're not neutral. We're not even-handed. We've said straight out we think Russia was wrong to invade Ukraine, and we've called on Russia to withdraw. And we've supported repeatedly in Israel's statements our support for Ukraine's territorial integrity and its sovereignty. So Israel is not neutral in this issue. We're part of the Western consensus. Where we have drawn a line for our own reasons is we've said we won't sell Ukraine offensive military capabilities. In other words, we've sold them defensive equipment like helmets and body armor and other defensive measures that help keep people alive. We've accepted refugees from the Ukraine. We've bought Ukrainians here for emergency medical treatment. We've established a field hospital in Ukraine. We've given massive humanitarian support for the Ukrainian people. But what we haven't done is we haven't given Ukraine offensive military capabilities. And the reason for this is, as you hinted in the question, was that we're concerned about a Russian blowback because the Russians are just across our northern border. And Israel has an interest in, while we support the Ukraine, we don't want to see the evaporation, the disintegration of the deconfliction understandings that were reached with Moscow a few years ago. I mean, ultimately, Russia is a power in Syria today. Israel is active in Syria. If one believes news reports, almost every night Israel is attacking an Iranian or a Hezbollah position somewhere in Syria. Those positions are often immediately adjacent to Russian military positions, and the Russians so far have not become involved, and Israel has freedom of the skies over Syria. And that's a crucial national security interest of the state of Israel. And so while we support the Ukraine, our decision to not sell them offensive military capabilities is precisely because while supporting them across the board on a whole host of issues, we see on those issues, we don't want to see our deconfliction understandings reached with Moscow in danger. Having said that, and I think in the past, Israel, which is part of the West, unequivocally part of the West, very critical of Putin's invasion, at the same time, because we've remained with these channels of communication to the Kremlin, the West has used us to try to mediate, to try to pass messages to Moscow. You'll recall last year when then Prime Minister Naftali Bennett went to Moscow at the request of the Ukrainian president and the German chancellor to see if it was possible to try to achieve a ceasefire and a Russian pullout. Now, I would think that the Ukraine and the West has an interest in Israel maintaining that flexibility, in Israel maintaining that open communication with the Kremlin, because ultimately this conflict can go on for years in a stalemate with much bloodshed, with no side being able to decisively defeat the other. And that's what many experts believe. Or there can be a diplomatic solution. And I believe Israel, which is part of the West, is positioned, maybe uniquely positioned, to help deliver a peaceful diplomatic solution. I hope that's possible.
You recently wrote a piece for the Jerusalem Post in which you extolled the long personal relationship between Prime Minister Netanyahu and U.S. President Joe Biden. How far do you think that will carry if Israeli policy is at odds with the United States?
So when you don't have policy differences, it's not important. But when you do have policy differences, and it's unclear to me as to whether we will have significant policy differences with the United States. Once again, I addressed before the issue of Iran, which could have been a serious bone of contention, seems to be sidelined at the moment through the Iranian behavior with Russia and the Ukraine and the way they're dealing with the protesters, the people who want freedom. And the issue of the Palestinians doesn't necessarily have to be a bone of contention either, precisely because I think it's understood increasingly in Washington that the Palestinians are a flawed peace partner. So if we if we do have differences, and it's possible there'll be differences. No, first of all, not every difference has to be a crisis. Not every disagreement between Jerusalem and Washington has to generate some sort of international crisis, yes? But having said that, when there are disagreements, if you have a good personal relationship at the top, and you do, Prime Minister Netanyahu knows President Biden for some 40 years, when they were both much younger. They met in the early 1980s in Washington when Netanyahu was the number 2 at the Israeli embassy in DC, and Biden was the junior senator, a young senator from Delaware. They forged a friendship there, a friendship that has endured over the last 4 decades. I've heard that when they've spoken on the phone, there is a warmth there, an affinity between the two. And that can be especially important in times of crisis. And I myself witnessed their conversations during the 2021 Gaza war, when there were some critical moments, and the Biden conversations with Netanyahu were crucial. And so I think that personal relationship that has existed, the friendship that has existed between these two men, can actually augment and help us overcome the bumps of the road when they do arise.
The intricacies of the new government are not insignificant. Understanding who speaks to what responsibilities is not going to be an easy matter, and there will be doubtless arguments over who's responsible for what. It seems to be a daunting task, so who's going to be directing traffic?
So I don't think Benjamin Netanyahu returned to the Prime Minister's office just to play second fiddle to other people in the coalition. Let's be clear. This is a man who's Israel's longest-serving Prime Minister, and he didn't fight his way back to the top to play second fiddle. I mean, he unprecedentedly not only became Israel's longest-serving Prime Minister since Israel's first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, but he's also unprecedentedly won a third term at Balfour, at the Prime Minister's office. We've had other Prime Ministers who've made comebacks, but we've never had a Prime Minister before who's lost the office twice to return. And that is Netanyahu. And he's done it to implement his own agenda. And of course, he's got coalition partners who he has to take into account. All Israeli governments have always been coalition governments, and minority parties in the coalition want to have their influence felt. That's natural. That's part of politics. But I have no doubt that Netanyahu will not allow coalition partners to dominate his agenda. He didn't fight his way back to the top to see others dominate his new government, that's for sure.
Much of the concern expressed for the government has come as a result of laws passed in order to accommodate the personal situations of ministers designate. Do you think it's a healthy situation to modify the nation's laws so an Aryeh Deri can serve in parliament after serving in prison himself?
I think it's not the first time in Israel we've had these sort of laws. And I think it's important to realize that none of these things are surprises, in that, let's say someone like Aryeh Deri, who has had his problems with the law in the past and went to jail even, but he nevertheless was elected with a sizable Knesset faction. And the Israeli people who voted for him knew about this history. And so you have a principle here of democracy. If everything was transparent and this person nevertheless was voted back to the Knesset with a sizable majority, can this person be neutralized politically? And the answer, I don't think, can be yes. Ultimately, this man went to jail, paid his price, and after being out of public life for a certain period of time, has come back and has been elected. And I think even the critics have to accept that his mandate from the people is genuine, and that his desire to be in government is supported by all those thousands who voted for him.
He was placed as interior minister, and therefore he may have to be denying entry into Israel for those who might have criminal records in a position that he was in as well. Is there a conflict of interest?
I don't think so necessarily. And don't forget, in Israel, we have checks and balances, and any decision taken by the Minister of the Interior that is unacceptable, yes, is challenged immediately in the courts. And as you know, our courts have a system, history of independence and professionalism. So I'm not particularly worried about those issues.
So what do you say to those who say Israel is anti-democratic?
I'd say it's just not true. I say it's a slander. I mean, Israel, we've just come out of a very robust and democratic free election. Once again, we're the only country in the Middle East that has such free elections. We've got an independent judiciary. We've got a free and open and very, very critical media. On what basis does anyone say Israel's not democratic? It's ridiculous. Israel has a multiple NGO society. We have freedom to speech, freedom of organization, freedom of the press. I mean, what freedom are we supposedly don't have in Israel? I just don't understand. I mean, if people want to play politics, yes, and they say, well, Israel's new government's not democratic, so they say that's playing politics. But substantively, what's not democratic about Israel? This government was elected by the people.
Ambassador Regev, the new finance minister, repealed 2 taxes, one on sweet drinks and one on disposable goods. There are many issues that need addressing. Is this a glimpse of what's to come? And why is it so important right now?
Let's judge this government by its actions. The issues you raised were an electoral promise that was made, and therefore I think they felt, the finance minister felt the need to do that at the very beginning. But I think one has to look at the whole context and not take one decision. And let's see how this he's never been finance minister before. Let's see how he behaves. Let's see how he acts. Let's see what he does for the Israeli economy. And as we said in the earlier part of this interview, economic issues are front and center because for Israelis, those pocketbook issues are often central.
There are only 5 women out of 30 ministers in the newly formed government, pushing Israel below many countries in the region, with Gila Gamliel being named intelligence minister. Israel claims to be the only democracy, as you just said, in the region, and yet the numbers tell sometimes a different story.
Well, I think actually, if you look at Prime Minister Netanyahu's party, you see more women, and that's a good thing, and some very senior women in the party. Of the coalition partners, obviously the ultra-Orthodox parties have historically not been open to women in leadership positions, and that you have to raise with them. Netanyahu doesn't choose for them how they treat women. And so that possibly affects the balance in the government in a negative way. I'm sure Netanyahu would like to see more women in the government. Having said that, he's said publicly, right, if some of these, let's say, more clericalist elements in the government have expressed concerns, let's say, about, the empowering of women or about LGBT rights and so forth, Netanyahu has drawn a line in the sand and said nothing in this government will undermine the freedoms and the equality that all Israelis enjoy today.
Could we go back for a moment to Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Biden and their alignments? You mentioned Iran and you mentioned some of the issues at large, including the Israeli-Palestinian issue. Do you see anything else coming up in the coming year that is a crucial alliance between the 2 countries?
I'm not sure. I know that because they know each other well, I don't think Netanyahu will want to surprise the president with anything. And I hope it won't be the other way around. Having said that, Iran is always an issue where Israel will reserve its right to act. And if we believe that the Iranians are getting dangerously close to a weapon and that necessitates Israeli military action, I think Israel could go it alone. And I don't know how the United States will react to that. I hope they would understand. But I don't think Netanyahu would be willing to subcontract out Israel's most vital national security. And in that situation, you could have tension between Israel and the United States. I do hope that America and Israel can reach understandings on Iran. Like, it's clear we're not going back to the JCPOA anytime soon. It's clear the Iranians are rapidly moving forward to a bomb. And I would hope that America and Israel can reach understandings where they work together to prevent Iran from getting a bomb. Once again, in the absence of that, however, Israel will, of course, reserve the right to act by itself, to defend its people. I mean, Iran with a nuclear bomb, that's something that Israel just cannot tolerate. Maybe for some people in America, that's just another foreign policy challenge. For Israel, that would be a major issue. It would be an existential issue. And Netanyahu has said in the past, and many of his ministers have said similar things, that we just could not accept such a reality. And that's something I think to watch very, very closely.
We spoke during your tenure as Israel's ambassador to the UK, and you said that it was important to engage and build bridges with the Muslim community. What should this new government be doing to include the Arab society and to deal with the inner city crime, which we spoke about earlier, that is so rampant, particularly in the last years?
So there are two issues that you raised. The one is domestically, and that's Israel's Arab minority. And I believe that they have an interest, as has been stated by Prime Minister Netanyahu, to get crime levels down in the Arab community, because the people who suffer from them most from that crime is the Israeli Arab community. And so I think Netanyahu will find many partners domestically as the government tries to deal with lawlessness in the Arab sector. Lawlessness that just takes too many lives, that prevents businesses flourishing. And I think here there's a common interest between the government and Israel's Arab citizens to work together closely to see what can be done and to defeat this crime wave that we're seeing over the last few months. On the larger issue internationally, I think by strengthening our relationships with our peace partners, with the new Abraham Accords countries, and by expanding the circle of peace, I think that's an important message to the Arab and Muslim world. There's no reason for us to fight. We have to overcome the differences of the past and work together. And let's remember what we have in common. We and the Arab countries are equally troubled by Iran. We are worried about Iran's role in the region, its support for terrorism, its quest for a nuclear weapon, its support for extremists throughout the region. And we see Iran in Iraq, we see Iran in Syria, we see Iran in Lebanon, we see Iran in Yemen. And neither us in Israel or the Arab countries want to see this very aggressive, revolutionary regime trying to dominate the Middle East and threaten our security and our independence. And so here there's common bonds between us and countries across the Arab world. We also have a common interest in making sure that the extremists of groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda don't get on the front burner again. We have much what we can do, and we all have an interest, us and the Arab countries, of course, in strong relationships with the West, economic relationships, security relationships. And so when we find our new Arab peace partners, we work with them. I think that's a very important message, not only for Muslims in the Arab world, but that's important for Muslims across the globe, both in the West and in Muslim countries.
As the penultimate spokesman, you've taken a backseat from politics. What's the reason?
Oh, I've got a great job at the moment. I'm as you said, I'm the head of the Abba Eban Center for Diplomacy and International Relations at Reichman University in Herzliya, Israel. And at our institute, we are working hard on some of these issues we've been talking about. And also because I'm now outside government, I have the freedom to write and to talk and to teach on these issues, which I didn't have when I was in government. And I'm very happy where I am.
Ambassador Mark Regev, a pleasure to have you with the Media Line, and we hope to come back to you as Prime Minister Netanyahu's government continues, and we'll see what's at work.
Thank you for having me.